It was April 30th, 1945. Deep beneath a shattered Berlin, in a concrete bunker buried 12 feet underground, a man sat alone in a small room and pressed a pistol to his temple. Above him, Soviet artillery shells tore the city apart. The walls shook, the lights flickered, and in that moment, 12 years of absolute power collapsed into a single, quiet trigger pull. But here is what they never told you. What happened in that bunker before the gun went off was far stranger, far darker, and far more desperate than any history book has dared to fully admit. The story of Adolf Hitler's final hours is not just a story of defeat. It is a story of denial, paranoia, poison, betrayal, and a regime so committed to its own mythology that it tried to erase the truth of its own ending. Governments sealed documents. Witnesses disappeared. And for decades, the full picture was deliberately, carefully buried. What you are about to hear is the version they hoped you would never find. To understand what happened on that final day, you have to go back to what the bunker actually was. The Führerbunker sat beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, accessed through a maze of corridors and glass doors. It was not glamorous. It was suffocating. Fluorescent lights hummed constantly because there was no natural light. The air was recycled and stale. Diesel generators roared day and night. The space was so cramped that staff could hear every conversation through the thin partition walls. This was where the most powerful man in Europe had chosen to spend his last weeks alive. Not in a palace, not in the mountains, in a hole in the ground, surrounded by yes men and collapsing maps. By mid-April 1945, the Soviet Red Army had encircled Berlin completely. General Georgy Zhukov commanded over 2.5 million soldiers closing in from the east. General Vasily Chukov pushed from the south. The city was burning. 2 million civilians were trapped inside, and Hitler, rather than surrendering or fleeing, had convinced himself that a miraculous counterattack was still possible. He moved phantom armies across maps. He shouted at generals who had no troops left to command. He believed, or forced himself to believe, that Germany could still win. The people around him knew the truth, but no one dared say it out loud. That is when the first shocking truth begins to emerge. By late April, Hitler was not the sharp, commanding figure of the propaganda reels. He was physically destroyed. Witnesses who saw him in those final days describe a man who shuffled when he walked, his left hand trembling so violently he had to press it against his thigh to hide it. His eyes were glassy and bloodshot. His face was pale and deeply lined. He had aged 20 years and 12 months. Some historians now believe he was suffering from Parkinson's disease, though this was never officially confirmed. His personal physician, Dr. Theodore Morel, had been injecting him for years with a cocktail of substances including methamphetamine, morphine derivatives, and bull testosterone. The man making decisions about the fate of millions was medically compromised and chemically altered, and almost no one in the outside world knew. On April 22nd, Hitler had one of his most spectacular breakdowns. During a military briefing, he was told that SS General Felix Steiner's army group had failed to launch the counterattack Hitler had ordered. Steiner had barely any men. The attack was fantasy. Hitler's response was unlike anything his staff had ever witnessed. He screamed for nearly an hour. He accused his generals of treason, cowardice, and incompetence. He declared that the war was lost. And then, for a brief moment of brutal honesty, he admitted he would die in Berlin. The room fell completely silent. Several officers reportedly wept. Then, just as quickly, Hitler pulled himself back from the edge, retreated into his delusion, and started issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. But here's where the story takes a turn that most documentaries skip entirely. On April 23rd, Hermann Göring, Hitler's designated successor, sent a telegram from Bavaria. He proposed that since Hitler was now trapped and unable to govern, Göring should assume leadership of the Reich. To most rational minds, this was a logical, if opportunistic suggestion. To Hitler, it was treason. He had Göring arrested immediately and stripped of all titles. The man who had built the Luftwaffe, who had stood beside Hitler for 2 decades, was now a prisoner because he had dared to suggest the obvious. The circle of loyalty in the bunker was collapsing inward, consuming itself. Then came Heinrich Himmler's betrayal, and this one cut even deeper. Himmler, the architect of the SS, the man Hitler had trusted more than almost anyone, had been secretly negotiating with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediary Count Folke Bernadotte. He had offered a German surrender to Britain and America, but not to the Soviets. He thought he could split the Allied coalition and perhaps even offer his services to the West against communism. When Hitler learned of this through a BBC radio broadcast on April 28th, his reaction was volcanic. He called Himmler a traitor. He ordered his arrest. He stripped him of every rank and position. In the span of 1 week, Hitler had lost faith in his two most powerful lieutenants. He was now surrounded almost entirely by secretaries, adjutants, and true believers who had nowhere else to go. April 28th was also the night Hitler married Eva Braun. This detail alone should stop you in your tracks. Here was a man who had led a nation for 12 years, who had conquered most of Europe, who had ordered the deaths of tens of millions of people. And with Soviet shells landing 3 blocks away, he held a small civil ceremony in the map room of the bunker. A city official was brought in to conduct this ceremony. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. Eva Braun wore a black dress. She reportedly laughed at several points. Hitler was described as emotionally flat. The ceremony lasted minutes. The champagne was opened, and then they went back to waiting to die. What happened in the early hours of April 29th sheds light on something the German government and later historians spent decades trying to contextualize away. Hitler dictated his final political testament. In it, he blamed the war entirely on international Jewry. He accepted no personal responsibility. He expressed no remorse for the devastation across Europe. Instead, he gave instructions for the future leadership of a Germany he believed would one day rise again. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor as Reich President and Joseph Goebbels as the new Reich Chancellor. He called on future Germans to maintain the racial laws. Even in his final written words, with the bunker shaking and his empire in rubble, he was still constructing the mythology. He was still performing the role he had written for himself 2 decades earlier in a Bavarian prison cell. And now we arrive at the moment history recorded and then immediately disputed. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his private study. Staff were told to gather in the corridor. A few minutes later, a single gunshot was heard. When the door was opened, Hitler was slumped on the sofa with a gunshot wound to his right temple. Eva Braun had not been shot. She had bitten down on a cyanide capsule. Both were dead. Their bodies were carried up to the Reich Chancellery garden above, doused in petrol and burnt. But here is the detail that cracked open decades of controversy. The burning was incomplete. Soviet soldiers who captured the site days later found charred remains. And what happened next to those remains is one of the most bizarre and contested stories of the 20th century. Soviet forces collected what they believed to be Hitler's remains. Stalin, deeply paranoid, refused to confirm Hitler's death publicly for years. He privately told Western leaders he believed Hitler had escaped. Whether he genuinely believed this or was using the uncertainty as a political tool remains debated. The Soviets kept fragments of skull and jawbone in their archives, classified in secret for decades. It was not until 2018 that French scientists were finally allowed to examine the teeth held in Moscow. Their analysis confirmed the dental records matched Hitler's. He had died in the bunker, but for 73 years, the Soviet Union had held the physical proof of his death in a secret archive, while the conspiracy theories multiplied across the world. Germany's own reckoning with the story was equally complicated. For years, there was a collective cultural resistance to humanizing Hitler in any way, to depicting him as a man who suffered or feared or broke down. The fear was that humanizing him would somehow diminish the horror of what he did, or worse, generate sympathy. Films that showed him screaming in the bunker were satirized across the internet. Academics debated whether the full truth of his psychological collapse was appropriate to teach. Documents related to his medical history, his psychological evaluations, and the full testimonies of bunker survivors were restricted, delayed, or carefully managed in their release. The Germany that emerged from the ashes of 1945 built its identity on repudiation of everything Hitler represented, and that repudiation sometimes extended to suppressing the full, complicated, deeply human account of how he ended. But the truth always surfaces. The testimonies of secretaries like Traudl Junge, who sat with Hitler the night before his death and transcribed his final testament, painted a picture the textbooks rarely capture. She described a man who, even at the end, held a strange spell over the people around him. Not because he was powerful anymore. He had no power left, but because the machinery of belief that he had spent his entire life constructing was still running inside the people who had given everything to it. They could not simply switch it off. Several bunker staff chose to die rather than face a world without the ideology that had defined them. Goebbels and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children and then killed themselves in the garden the following day. 6 children. Their names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Hydra. The youngest was 4 years old. That is the true final horror of the bunker. Not the death of one man, but the death of innocents killed by the faith they had been born into. Hitler died at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th, 1945. Within 8 days, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The bunker was partially demolished by the Soviets, then buried, then forgotten under East German urban development, then rediscovered, then debated, then turned into a modest parking lot with an informational plaque. There is no monument. There is no museum. Just a small sign, easy to miss, in a quiet corner of a modern city that has spent 80 years deciding what to do with the ghost beneath its streets. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth of all. The most destructive regime in modern history ended not with a dramatic final battle, not with a public reckoning, not with a moment the world could witness and process together, but with a quiet gunshot in a concrete room, a body burned in a garden, and 8 decades of nations, governments, and historians still arguing over what exactly happened, what it meant, and whether we have truly learned anything at all.